Welcome to everybody, and as Sally mentioned, this is the first in our spring-summer series. We've got about a dozen happy hour sessions between now and the end of July, and indeed we've had a short break since our last happy hour session, which was back in December, nearly about 4 months ago to the day. But obviously, the intervening period, we also had a highly successful virtual annual conference at the end of February, at the beginning of March. And for anybody who joined us at that summit will know that we had a taster, one of our sessions on new models of care from Debbie Ownstead, who was a commissioner on the subject that we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail today in relation to the Archbishops Commission Reimagining Care. And I'm delighted we've got a fantastic group of speakers, both in person but also on a video as well that we'll be sharing with you. First of all, we've got Anna Dixon, who I'm sure needs no introduction to any of you. She's a dear friend to the HousingLIN. Thanks very much for joining us. She chaired the Commission on Reimagining Care, and she's going to give us an overview and some of the high-level insights of what that Commission set out. Baroness Kay Andrews needs no introduction. Kay, I've known you for many a year, and you were a fantastic champion for Lifetime Homes, Lifetime Neighbourhoods, not that long ago, but it probably feels a bit longer. But your influential report as chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Adult Social Care is a fantastic report, and you're going to sort of draw attention to the links between that and the Commission, highlighting some of the points around housing in particular. Rich, lovely to have you with us this afternoon. Rich, again, is a key member of both West Midlands ADAS, a co-production member of that, but also closer to home where I live. He's a board member of the Barnwood Trust and has a lot to say around how we work much more effectively in co-producing solutions. Jenny Carter-Pellis is going to join us with a video that she's prepared on her work with the Open University, and we look forward to watching that. And last but not least, Boris. Boris, really pleased that you could step in and join us. Boris Worrell is the Group Chief Exec of a housing association called Rooftop that provides a lot of really high quality homes for older adults and general needs housing. And you hear a little bit more from Boris about the work of Rooftop in this space. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna. And Anna, thanks ever so much for kicking off our series this year, in fact, yes.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be with you again at the happy hour. I think we did a session very early on with HousingLIN when we were sort of setting out to work on the Archbishops Commission on Reimagining Care. So for those of you who can remember, it was launched back in 2021. So we worked for over 18 months as a commission, and we used our time to listen to a range of people, including people who draw on care and support and their carers. And our task that we were given by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York was to reimagine care and support in England, and really wanted to be quite radical in thinking about it, but also drawing on theology, which was the, I guess, thing that made this quite a unique endeavour. So our report, that's called Care and Support Reimagined, a National Care Covenant for England, was published at the end of January, so since the last happy hour. So it's really great that we've got this chance to sort of come back and talk to you about what the Commission concluded, and also how we're working with others to see action and get that implemented. So I was the chair, along with a co-chair, the Bishop of Carlisle, James Newcombe, who sits in the House of Lords as the lead bishop on health and social care, and also sat along with Baroness Andrews, who was a member of her committee in the Lords. So that was a really good link, and there were other commission members who worked alongside us through those 18 months, together with external advisors and staff at Lambeth Palace. So if we go to the next slide, please. So one of the first things we did, as I say, was we wanted to listen to what people's experiences were, but also ask people themselves, if they were to reimagine care, what would it look like? And, you know, of course, this has been quite a challenging period for many people who draw on care and support. And we heard really just how complex, confusing and difficult to navigate people found care and support. Unpaid carers and care workers were really feeling very overstretched. You know, we hear, you know, about how much, particularly during COVID, a lot of people really, family members took on a lot of additional care, but also the level of vacancy rates that we know that are in the care sector is leaving people feeling both stretched, but also this sense of not being valued, not being recognised, not being visible. And then, of course, for those people who were drawing on both social care and the NHS, there was a sense that it wasn't coordinated and they were working in separate systems. So these are things I think that are common to what we hear from others. But if we could go to the next slide, please. We did also hear positive things, in particular about the fantastic support that people get in their communities and from their communities. And that includes churches and faith communities of which people were a part. And we particularly took the time to speak to people who were members of faith communities about their experience of what they gain, how included they feel. And it's clear that that is a very important and vital source of informal support that people get with their sort of everyday living, and how important it is to feel part of those communities and belong. We did hear examples of proactive local authorities who were doing some really great community-led initiatives. And that was very positive. And we did also hear about housing associations and other progressive housing providers who similarly were doing innovative things. And then, of course, we did hear a lot about the fantastic support that family carers and care workers are giving to people who draw on care and support to live good lives, although, as we've heard, under quite difficult circumstances. So all that information, together with our sort of theological input, led us to come up with a vision for care and support. If we could go to the next slide, please. So for us, with this idea that we're all created in God's image, we wanted to get across the idea that it's about enabling people to flourish, to have an abundant life, to live their life to the full. And it's very aligned to the social care future vision of living a good life. From our principles, we also felt that it was really critical that people had access to care and support on a fair basis. And we heard a lot about people struggling to access care or afford care. And we felt that there was this idea that care and support is universal. It's something that we all need at some point in our lives. We wanted that care and support reflected loving kindness and empathy, that those sorts of principles were embedded within everybody who was providing care. That society, and this includes churches, should be inclusive of everybody, of all ages and abilities, enabling people to fully participate as citizens. And finally, we wanted to see that care and support promoted mutuality. So there's a lot of talk about independence, about choice and control, which all are very important. But I think, and this may be something that Jenny reflects on, about this is a very relational thing. It's really about recognizing our interdependence on one another. And we felt that that was an important basis for care and support. So that was our vision. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in order to realise that vision, we set out a whole series of recommendations, which I don't have time to go through now, but I really encourage you. There's a great video that's very short to watch on our website. There's a short version as well as the full report if you'd like to take a look. But really, we organised our recommendations under 3 areas. The first one was rethinking attitudes. The second was the need to rebalance roles and responsibilities, that is, of the state, of communities, of families and individuals. And finally, redesigning the system. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So in terms of rethinking attitudes, we were really clear that a lot of people didn't really understand what care and support was, largely because of the way it's been rationed. People were very focused on a minimalist sort of service that maybe just was involving helping people, get up, get dressed, and so on, rather than seeing this much broader benefit of care and support as allowing people to live life to the full, meeting their spiritual, emotional, as well as practical needs. So we feel that this is really important to change public attitudes, so people really understand care and support in this much wider sense and much more positive sense. The other aspect is that it does affect us all, this idea of this universality. And we were very taken with the campaign in America about caring across generations, and another one in Australia, which communicated this sense that at different times in our lives, almost all of us will either be caring for someone or be cared for by someone. We did think, though, that part of the reason that care and support is not given the priority that we feel it should is not only this sort of lack of understanding of what it is and its importance and its value, but also because of the underlying attitudes to age and disability. And so we wanted to also challenge, and this is as much in the church as in wider society, some of these attitudes to age, disability and mental illness. And we, in these areas, I've been really pleased that Social Care Futures obviously is taking forward this idea of the wider narrative, and we had a great webinar with Caring Across Generations to sort of understand that. So we do hope that there will be funding now put behind a more public-facing movement to build support for care and support. And also my old organisation, Centre for Ageing Better, is launching a big campaign on ageism. So there are ways in which this is already being taken forward. Please, can I go to the next slide? So this second area, rebalancing roles and responsibilities, the big idea here was the need for a national care covenant. And we really hope that as we go into the next election, we will see political parties putting this down as something that needs to happen, where we have a deep public dialogue, that all stakeholders are involved, and that we set out very clearly, like the NHS Constitution does for the NHS, what are the principles and values? What can you expect? What are the roles and responsibilities of the state, of families, and of individuals, and of communities? And within that, we would like to see sort of more support for communities and all that they do. So an investment to make sure that community support is available everywhere to everyone. We think there needs to be a new deal for unpaid carers to give them the practical, financial and emotional support to do the amazing job that they do when people choose to take on those caring responsibilities. And rather than it being out of necessity, we would like to see that return to something that is more voluntary. But that where people do take on that role, they're properly supported to do it. We do think that over time, we should be moving to a more universal support. First of all, making sure that that preventative support, that low-level support in the community is there for everybody, whether they self-fund or whatever level of need they have. But that over time, we would see a more generous state in providing access and making affordable care to everybody. And obviously, all of this does depend on us taking an active role as citizens, looking out for people in our communities, but also being willing to pay our taxes as citizens to support others who may have a greater need than us. So the final area, if I may go to the next slide, is redesigning the system. And here, I suppose this is where we got into sort of a bit more the nuts and bolts of how care and support works. And we basically said, you know, it doesn't really work for people and it needs to be quite radically redesigned. And a lot of this, and hopefully we'll have reflections from Rich, was really about co-producing and putting people in the lead and simplifying assessment, giving people a much stronger entitlement. We heard a lot about how direct payments have become quite bogged down in bureaucracy. So again, trusting people to manage their own care, to decide what support they need, making sure that those who need and want it can get independent advocacy to access those rights and entitlements. And alongside that, sort of rethinking the workforce in terms of redesigned roles. But I want to touch on two aspects that I think are most relevant to the HousingLIN briefly. Within our redesigned system was the role of housing and technology. So if we go first to housing. So we're next slide. We visited some really fantastic places during, one of them was Bank House, Tonic at Bank House. So this is an LGBTQ affirmative community, which I believe has featured in one of the HousingLIN seminars previously. And think that it's just really important that we do have a wide range of accessible housing options. And by diversity, don't just mean in terms of, location, but style, and, that there are places that people can live fully themselves. And in this case, obviously, a community that was affirming of people's sexuality, but there may be other communities as our older population becomes more diverse ethnically and culturally as well. We also saw really great examples of supported living environments that were very integrated with the wider community. And I think that's a real challenge to some of the locations of some of the supported living. They're not necessarily embedded within the community, but we saw some great examples that are, and I think we would like to see more of that. We put recommendations back to the Church of England to consider how it uses its land assets, other assets and investments to support more of this type of housing. So that might be something quite interesting to follow up. And the other was, we heard some of the challenges, particularly of the not-for-profit sector, in securing social investment to expand the diversity of housing with care, and particularly the care support that's required into people's homes. So those were some of the things that we touched on in creating diverse housing options. And related to this, if I could go to the final slide, please, was harnessing technology. And here we feel it's really important. We again saw good examples of how technology, assistive technology, was being sort of built in from the start. So I also visited the Care Village designed for people with dementia in Warwickshire, and they've built in technology around acoustic listening, which means that they don't have to disturb people at night, but they can be aware if people are getting up and wandering in the night, and making sure that they're safe. We know that the digital technology is a huge enabler for people to be in control. And making sure that everyday technology, whether it's voice operated technologies or touchscreen pads, are really being utilized to their full to enable people to do things for themselves. But obviously there's a cutting edge of AI and robotics coming, and there's already been some interesting tests of this. I think that needs to be invested in further, and really seeing what the application of that can be, and making sure that it's very user-centered in the way it's designed. But we've got tech already that's not being used, and part of that is training carers, care workers to have the confidence to use it, and making sure that in all of this, that it is inclusive and accessible in the way it's designed and utilised. So those are just some of the aspects of the report. I've given a very sort of high-level overview, but you can see that there are some elements there where we do think there are some clear opportunities to start delivering against our vision, which we see as a 10-year sort of journey, and something that we can all together work towards, including churches and faith communities playing their part. So thank you very much.
Anna, thank you. That's a really great start to the session, with a really sort of insightful outline, both of the covenant, but also just finishing off with those housing and technology pieces. I know that's something that we've been really informed by when we've been developing the HAPPI design principles for technology, about that inclusivity and that accessibility. So thank you very much for you and the team for pulling that together. I know it was a lot of hard work over 18 months. We're going to move on, though, quickly, because again, another person who's spent a lot of time thinking about this, especially in relation to the House of Lords and the Select Committee you chair, Kay. So Baroness Andrews, delighted that you could join us and follow on from Anna. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to share with Anna and everybody else our experiences of putting our report together, which was a sort of bookend in a way with the Archbishops Commission. So you had church and state coming to almost identical conclusions in our reports, from a slightly different approach with some different language, but essentially, and you would expect this, finding the same sorts of issues, the same sorts of challenges, and the same prescriptions as to what is actually needed. And we did have a shared person in the shape of Bishop James Carlisle. Whoops, put that off. And that was very helpful in many different respects, actually. we used the title, A Gloriously Ordinary Life, for our report. And I thought that was inspired. It wasn't our title. It was in our efforts to do as much co-production as possible. We took evidence from a lot of experts by experience. We had 2 specialist advisors, one of whom was an expert by experience. The title itself comes from Social Care Futures. And I thought it absolutely exemplifies exactly what it is we're all trying to articulate in our ambitions and in the shared ambitions for people who are affected by all forms of adult social care, whether you're in receipt of it or you're giving it. And our total immersion over a year just helped us to realize not just the scale of the problem, the enormous complexity of the problem, the diversity of it in different parts of the country, the enormous variety of different types of care, whether you're caring for an adult young adult who will grow up with disabilities, the lifelong commitment, or whether you're dealing with a sudden change in your life with a partner who's just had a stroke and you simply do not know where to start in accessing help. And at the heart of all of it, actually, in so many ways, is housing. It's come to the fore because of the issues around discharge from hospital, and the 13,000 people can't get discharged and should be able to be living safely in their own home and getting better faster and at less risk. But it also reflects some of the work that I and Jeremy have shared over the past 15 years, when we have been looking at what it takes to build a housing estate, an estate in the wider sense, for an aging society. You wouldn't think actually aging could take us by surprise. It's one of the few things that's predictable. And yet somehow it seems to have. And we have been arguing for more than a decade that in order for social justice, not just for efficiency and human rights, we need to think about housing as integrated with health, because it is in the front line of health. And we need to think about it in terms of what it is people need to age in place, to age safely, with all the implications that has for the types of care they need, the sort of people that will provide care, and how we plan for the future. Because bearing in mind that in another 10 years, we'll have about 2 million people without families to care for them. So we should have started thinking about that now and planning for it. And that's one of the things that comes up strongly in our report. The social care white paper did actually, for the first time, make a feature of housing, and we were very, very pleased to see it. £300 million attached for developing housing options. Unfortunately, at the same time, the next steps document, which came out a fortnight ago, said virtually nothing. We still do not know whether that money is committed and is something we're following up. But in itself is a drop in the ocean, because essentially, while all this thinking and planning has been going on, we've seen the loss of care and repair, for example, which did enormously valuable work about adapting homes across the country. And we have seen this growing crisis in terms of hospital waiting lists. So where we started from essentially was pretty fundamentally that the whole of future housing needs to be fit for people as they grow older, grow infirm, grow more fragile with disabilities. Not everybody does, but many do. And a house, a home which can actually accommodate those changes is what we all need. So we do say, for example, that all the new housing stock ought to be built actually at true lifetime minimum accessible standards. And I think, frankly, that is almost the least we could specify. All new build residential properties across all tenures, and the rented sector is particularly important in this, meet standards of accessibility and inclusivity, including for sensory impairments, learning disabilities, and autism spectrum disorders. And that sort of evidence came at us from every direction, because frankly, things can only get worse. And at the moment, we've got For example, one figure, the Centre for Aging Better, has shown that 20% of homes which are occupied at the moment by over 75 or over are classed as non-decent. So we have the most vulnerable, the elderly, the least able to make their own choices at the moment, in the worst conditions. And of course, this is all combined with our commitment to, in the report, to greater choice and control, greater independence, and greater autonomy. We also, of course, looked at what the loss of choice actually means. What else can we do here and now, actually, to meet some of these very specific needs that people who are receiving adult social care needs? Now, the Disability Facilities Grant is excellent. It always has been, and it has been increased over the years, but it just does not come near matching the requirements, particularly if you have a child, for example, with complex needs, who really needs a whole environment to support them. So whereas it's brilliant at putting, ramps in and rails in, sometimes what it really needs is a whole rethink of the design of the whole home. So we need the ability to do that. So we've also said that we have to have an increase in capital funding to secure a new supply of purpose-built supported housing and revenue funding to enable people to live independently. Now, when you're arguing for more money for social care, you can actually sound like a real fantasist under the present circumstances. But our argument essentially is that if we support social care in its own right, the preventative element actually pays for itself, while at the same time, you're absolutely in the front line of helping the NHS work its way through the post-pandemic crisis. So this is investment. So one of our big statements is to follow the recommendation of the Select Committee in the House of Commons on Health and Social Care, chaired by no less than Jeremy Hunt when he was the chair of that committee, saying basically another 7 billion a year to close the gap that we presently have. And it seems like a very sound investment indeed. And that's why we're saying in our report that adult social care should be a national imperative. It's the same, it's different language, but it's essentially the same sorts of things that the Archbishops Commission has been saying. We have to make this an entitlement. It was left out of the 1945 Health and Social Services Settlement because it was different then. People were not living as long. Women did not work. They were not factored in to part of in the social context, the social contract around what people could contribute and what they could give and what they would get back. So it's bringing the welfare state up to date, making it fit for purpose as well as everything else. So basically that's very, very briefly, there's some bones of what we've been saying. I'm pursuing, as you'd expect, what is going to happen to the housing commitment in the white paper. One other thing we did say about rented properties, because as I say, those tend to be the ones where the poorer people live, people with the greatest insecurity, least prospects. And we've also recommended that the government should introduce an accessibility and inclusivity standard for marketing residential properties for rent, and they should be listed as such. And that would give people some security, as you know, of knowledge as well as security in terms of how they can live. So that's where we went. Digital technologies, of course, Anna has said everything that we would say. We absolutely need to be more innovative, and we've recommended a Centre for R&D, an R&D network across social care to capture what's possible in terms of innovation, which we saw, like the Archbishops Commission, in many parts of the country. But there are some brilliant technologies out there, like, for example, Tribe, which matches, which plots the lack of care with the skills that could possibly fill the gaps. Lots of amazing things going on, which we can't capture at the moment because the agencies are not there. The report has 37 different recommendations, and three of which are about housing, but many others impact on housing as well. So I think I'm going to finish there, Jeremy. I think I've had my 10 minutes, but thank you again for the opportunity to share what we have done with everybody else.
Okay, thank you also for your overview, but also we will follow you with interest because of your questions around both the Transformation Fund, but also the Next Steps document. The one, I suppose, silver lining for many of us in the sector was that the Next Steps document did highlight the need for an older person's housing task force. I've just noted on our participant list that the appointed chair is actually listening and watching in. So I know that she will be really keen to take some of the messages and try and articulate those and work with us and you at the APPG for Housing and Care next week. And I believe she's a guest speaker. So Julianne, delighted that you could join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Right, without further ado, I'm going to move on. So Sally, our next speaker.
I think it's Rich next. So Rich, if you're happy to share your slides, if not, I can do that on your behalf.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were sharing the slides. Rich, over to you.
Hi everyone, it's a privilege to be here today.
Oh, sorry, Rich.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's the same with everyone else, but I've got the notes slide rather than the full picture.
Okay, 1 second.
Thank you.
If it's possible for you to do it, please.
Yeah, of course. There we go.
Okay, great.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and it's a real privilege to be able to be here today at this webinar. My name is Richard Amos, and you may well be thinking that the speech is going to be from a service user. However, I grapple whenever I hear that term, and hope by the end of my talk you'll understand why. I'm a son, brother, friend, a member of West Midlands ADAS Regional Co-Production Advisory Network. I'm a socialite, an employer, I'm a lover of life, I'm dependent, I'm a Wolves fan, I've been an England boccia champion, I'm disabled, but I'm a person. Before I go any further, I'd like to pay homage to the Reimagining Care report. It's a privilege to be on the same call as Anna, and after studying the report, would like to draw some highlights. Next slide, please. A report describes, at the heart of this report is a deeply Christian understanding of what it looks like to live together in community with people caring for and supporting one another in relationships characterized by mutuality and independence. We urgently need to get away from using independence as the beacon and move towards interdependence as the destination, recognizing it as a strength-based approach of the utilization of skills and experiences from one another. Because in reality, what can really be achieved alone? And if independence is solely being used as a belief that it is doing things for yourself, then I would still be in bed right now. But am I less any independent? I'll let you decide. There is a national call to see healthcare and housing as one, because one can't work without the other. each equally important, and the role of housing in communities really lays the foundation. But first, allow me to ask you, what does home mean to you? Next slide, please. Is it the security of having a roof over your head? Is it the sanctuary to escape to after a long day at work? Or the assurance of a home being a place to watch your family grow up in? A reality for many disabled people is that just to get a roof over your head isn't a decision we can make alone. Because I don't think people working in the system understand how complex navigating the system is just to get a place to call your own, when there is such a shortage of suitable housing and the system is under-resourced. Next slide, please. The example of the shortage of suitable housing is something I have direct experience of, as since my girlfriend died in 2001, I've been liable for all of the rent. Positive interventions are the discretionary housing payment, but it's taken 16 months to find alternative accommodation, which I'm very lucky is a development currently being built and should hopefully move there next month. Next slide, please. We should think about homes as more than bricks and mortar. We need to use homes as places for connection. Housing should support inclusion, not seclusion, and integration, not segregation. Houses are fixed, but people's lives aren't. People's lives change, which should be recognised in policy and practice. The people at the heart of white paper has made the headlines, unfortunately, for all of the wrong reasons lately. As we absorb what the news means for the sector, we have to keep in the back of our minds that the estimated 1.9 million households in England that are home to someone with a health condition that requires an adaptation to their home to support everyday tasks are still there, and that number will only increase. Next slide, please. Speak about translating government reform, developing system transformation, and working smarter with service delivery sounds a world away from the human connection you build with people, and begs the question of how do statutory agencies know exactly what is needed. That's where co-production comes in. Next slide, please. You'll already be aware co-production features as one of 10 foundational principles. However, next slide, please. Co-production is more. Co-production is the process of nurturing relationships with its beneficiaries and those who have lived and learnt experiences to invite people to be equal partners, from grassroots to strategic ways of giving views co-creating and influencing. Very simply, involving people. When we think of lived experiences, we are not a directory that we can simply shelve and press play to because of the etiquette of the situation we are in. What we are human beings enriched by the tapestry of our identities, from faith to our economic situation, shaped by the growing of our way when we were kids, any trauma we may have been exposed to, and the beliefs and values we hold. As I wrap up my speech, my top tip to co-producing well is being aware of what it takes to do co-production well. What lies behind the engagement is the adoption of co-production being understood and embedded in the culture, a co-design strategy, a budget for remuneration, and acceptance that it needs to be led by the process rather than deadlines. If these aspects are considered with equal importance, then you'll soon be reaping the rewards. Thank you for listening.
Rich, and your details are now up, and thanks ever so for a really powerful contribution this afternoon. And I know that you and I talked a bit about this at the ITEC conference last month, and you've added more to it, and you've really given a powerful overview of why this is so important. So thank you, and I look forward to the debate that we'll have shortly. Sally, thanks ever so for managing those slides too. I think you're also going to put Jenny's video now, so over to you, and then we're going to conclude, last but not least, with Boris. So Boris, we'll be with you shortly.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Just let me know if you can hear the audio or not.
Hello. Reimagine.
It's cutting out a bit.
Let me try something else. Right, we'll try this. Otherwise, we might have to come back to it at the end. Is that better? No. Okay, I'm not sure we're going to get the audio working at the moment, but I can have a look in the background, perhaps if we move on and then return to Jenny potentially.
Boris, are you all right if we step into you while we're doing that, while we have the technical glitch?
Yeah, of course.
Boris,
Great,
over to you. Well, thanks ever so for stepping in. And,
okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I haven't got any slides, but I have got some thoughts, and I'm going to build a little bit on what Anna and Baroness Andrews and Rich have said from a provider perspective. And I noticed there's some good questions about housing supply and affordable housing in the Q&A, which I'm guessing, Jeremy, we can pick up after this. Rooftop's got 4 extra care schemes in Worcestershire and Gloucestershire. They range from the big, so kind of 180, 200 apartments in Gloucester, and it's good to have our Gloucester colleague Dave Durden on the attendees this afternoon. I hope that's you, David. Hello, if it is. Down to some much smaller schemes of 50 or so. And we've also got quite a big raft of sheltered housing too. Nationally and regionally, I think we're approaching what you might call a crisis point in this provision. We're talking about a customer base who are high demand. They're also increasingly high need. We're seeing demographic change within the extra care model, if you like. And that to a large degree is driven by funding pressures. So in order for care providers to generate enough income and return to preserve viability, you need higher need, higher dependency levels within those extra care schemes. So people who moved into, for example, our Gloucester scheme, St Oswald's, 12 years ago, tell me that this is becoming less like an extra care scheme and more like a care home. There's a range of factors which are driving this. One of them is kind of labour shortages and rising costs, which are also reflected in increasing service charges. So there's an affordability problem starting to crystallise in the supported housing space. There's a staffing problem. There's a fundamental viability problem. There's a demographic change problem. And I think Anna talked about the need for a new system or a new model, and I think that's absolutely the case. I think that if we continue like this, we're going to be in a place where it just stops working in the kind of medium horizon, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. I think it starts to potentially fail just as a model. And I think there's a risk that housing providers like Rooftop, which are medium, small, will or have stopped developing some of this supported housing. And if they haven't already, they may well do soon. So there's a lot of issues there, but it's not all bad news. I am going to come on to some positives and some opportunities in a minute, but I wanted to give an operational reality check on the challenges we face, which are multifaceted. I think Baroness Andrews talked about the complexity and the many moving parts. But if we imagine a system around supported housing in particular, the pressure is on all of those parts, from a customer perspective, from a care provider perspective, from a basic viability perspective, from a customer expectation and management perspective. It's got all the hallmarks of a system under huge strain, and it's holding up for now, but we need to do something different. We need to do something different probably quite quickly. I'll come on to that now in terms of what are the opportunities then if we've got a system under strain. Anna talked about something I think this country should talk more about, which is taxation. And taxation is a good thing because taxation pays for things. And we need to have an honest conversation about the kind of country we want, and the kind of social care and supported housing system we want, and what that costs. And then we need to get the taxation in to fund that properly, because fundamentally, the biggest problem we have is, I think, a lack of revenue funding. The good news is there is capital funding out there to build supported housing. Homes England is and always has pretty much provided good capital grant rates for supported housing. So it's not the buildings which are a problem. Building the buildings is the least of our worries. It's the revenue and cost and labour market, and I appreciate kind of the Commission's focus is on some of the softer, more important kind of aspects about how we think and talk and articulate this. I'm kind of looking at bricks and mortar and money and how we deliver. I think Richard was absolutely right when he talked about we need to think about housing and health in a much more unified way. And there's some really good news in that space through local authority work with housing providers and health. there's good things happening in Gloucestershire, there's good things happening in Worcestershire. Both of those counties now have senior level people working across health and housing to try and fix some of these problems and do exactly what Richard has suggested, which is join the sectors and the ecosystems up. Baroness Andrews will know much more about this than me, but I sense another opportunity is that this is not a kind of contentious political battleground in the sense that something like Brexit is. I think there's probably, broad support that, this isn't kind of working how it should, and it needs a new system and a new settlement, and that's a good thing in my mind. So it feels like there could be some political consensus, but as I think, as the Baroness has already articulated and has previously spoken about, it hasn't kind of landed quite yet, and it needs that political will as well as that political consensus. So I think we've got some really difficult operational delivery continuity challenges ahead, and the consequences for real people are not good at all unless we solve this. I think the final piece of good news or opportunity is that the housing association sector is actually quite good at this. There are some specialist providers who are very good at this, and there is opportunity in sector consolidation and specialist provider consolidation, and we're seeing more of that activity. So without getting into too much detail, if you're rooftop and you have less money and more demand than you've ever had before, what can you do? Well, you can stop doing complex stuff. If you're larger, you can soak a bit more of that up. So I do think the direction of travel in the housing association sector it does offer opportunities as well as threats. So I'm going to stop there, Jeremy. I hope that's given kind of some kind of on the ground context, if you like.
Boris, that's great. And yes, no, absolutely. And I think you also gave us sort of a bit of a reality check in terms of some of the pressures you experience, both as some of the relationships, but also that viability. And, I'm sure your board are wanting to know exactly where to invest that the resources you've got, both in terms of your workforce, but also the working capital that you have. So we'll come back to it, because I think the point that everybody's made is about how do we create a more affordable, socially valuable, and something that offers a dividend both to citizenships, but also in terms of in wider society, but also in terms of the system improvements as well. Now, Sally, I'm going to just ask: have we managed to sort of rectify the sound on the on Jenny's video?
We may have done. Let me give it another go.
It's not working for me, I'm afraid.
Okay.
What I'm going to suggest is we will skip this and have a little bit more time for the question and answers. But for those of you who want to see Jenny's contribution, we will be posting this on the website. Apologies, Jenny, that it just hasn't worked this afternoon. I think the bandwidth that we're working on is impaired. So we'll come back to that, and people can watch at their leisure. So if I could sort of quickly move on to the Q&A session, and I know that several of you have already posted responses in the answer column. I'm going to review some of those because I think just in case people haven't seen them, so there's some real great burning questions. But I'm going to start off with a question from a dear friend and close colleague, Jackie Martell. And she touches on the issues around, well, probably around some of the legal challenges and some of the sort of issues around the broader view of what care should cover. And sort of she points out some of this is already enshrined in law, the Care Act and the like. Have people thought about more funding to legal challenge some of this? Anybody want to come in on that?
I'm happy to kick off. we had quite a lot of debate within the Commission about the Care Act. Very good piece of legislation, sets out a very broad and holistic view of well-being and how care and support, should be defined. So yeah, would include making sure people have appropriate housing to enable them to experience well-being in terms of where they live. But obviously we know that local authorities just don't have, in many cases, the funding to fulfill the Care Act statutory and legal sort of obligations. So there is a sort of problem at the moment, and that people also then don't have access really either to information or support, whether that be legal aid or other support, to then challenge where they feel they're not getting their rights and entitlements under the Care Act. But I think, obviously more could be done to strengthen the ability to challenge. But I think that that's much more we should be arguing, is that there is more funding for local authorities to fulfill their duties in the first place. Now, that's not just about money. There are things I think that need to change in the culture and approach within local authorities and within social work in some places to deliver fully on the Care Act obligations. But I mean, I would go along with the EHRC report, which has recently come out, which suggests some things about strengthening the local government ombudsman and so on, to help people advocate for what they are entitled to. But I think we don't want to go down a very legalistic route to, in effect, have local authorities in the courts when really it's a problem of money.
Thanks, Anna. Kay, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, if I may. We also looked at it, actually. We came to the same conclusions as Anna's just described. We had a particular witness who was very keen on identifying this gap between what is legally entitled, what a person is legally entitled to, and so on, and what they're actually getting. And Anna is absolutely right. What they don't get is a matter of funding, not because their rights are deliberately being withheld. But more to the point, in a way, we had witnesses telling us that they didn't want to follow up on what they were not getting because they thought they might get less. If they went for assessment, they might end up having to ask their father or their mother to do more hours rather than fewer. And that was the crucial and horrible finding, actually, that wasn't uncommon. What we did actually come up with, though, and it's not the answer, but it's important because we would really try to interrogate the notion of invisibility, because the invisibility that is social care sector as a whole, because we had been, Andrew Dilnott, who worked with us closely, said very clearly at the beginning, the problem with social care is why don't people care more? And one of the reasons they don't care more is because they don't come across the system unless they're in dire need. It's not a universally within reach and within view. Absolutely true, but my God, when you do need it, you really do need it. So we tried to tackle the problem of invisibility, giving greater voice and agency. And the obvious thing to do, and you mentioned the old age, the task force on old age, fine. We've had an awful lot of task forces in this country. And we came up with the idea of a commissioner for social care and support, not an original idea. And maybe there'll be skepticism about it, but at least, like the Welsh Commissioner on old age, it will actually give some presence, it'll give some agency. And in the situation where we have nothing, that can be a good thing. And that can be the person, I hope it would be a person with a lived experience, who would actually take, I think, this legal gap and address it. But also, actually, Anna's quite right about the Care Act 2014. It's a disgrace that it hasn't been implemented. So many good principles, so much, we wouldn't be here, actually, in a way, if that act had been fully implemented. So much of that is due to funding as well.
Oh, thanks, Kay. And I think you've had, Jackie, you've had sort of some really interesting responses there. I mean, the other thing for me is the importance of advocacy, full stop. In order for people to exercise those rights and those choices at a local level. And there's a question here from Julian about peer support and circles of support. And I'm just wondering whether anybody on the panel is interested in that area. How do we still get that access to advocacy, that intersectionality and mutuality, which again sort of underpins a lot of the Commission's report. Rich, any thoughts on that to start off with? I think you raised that point about intersectionality, about that interdependency as well.
Yeah, I think advocacy needs to be more widely available, and certainly through the Care Act. And as soon as you're able to vocalise anything, you're not deemed as eligible for advocacy. But advocacy is a lot bigger than just having the support to vocalise your wishes. It's about having that emotional support. It's about having the support to even out the power dynamics through assessments, because they can feel like an interrogation if you're not used to that environment. And we need to build people up so they're prepared to face assessments and they feel empowered to be who they want to be, and not that it's just going to be a case of a tick box exercise.
Yeah, that's good. And one of the questions that comes up, I think, is from Rebecca, is about how to show sort of greater leadership in order to promote sort of citizenship and the role of the church and other faith communities in relation to that. I'm just wondering, Anna, whether there's anything that you think that comes out, which, because there's also a stream of questions around the use of church buildings from Sarah. Lovely to have you with us, Sarah. I know you've spoken at various HousingLIN events in the past as well, about looking at both sort of supply side in terms of reimagining church buildings, but also coming back to Boris's point around the importance of home and community as well. So any thoughts around some of those points?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a view, obviously not officially from the church, but sort of what we've said and hope. So, clearly the Church of England specifically, does own land and has assets and buildings, as you say, both church buildings, vicarages and so on. And, I think there is a question about how could they be used to facilitate this delivery of the vision towards having more diverse housing. So that's something we would definitely hope the church commissioners and others who make those sorts of decisions, nationally and then within diocese, would be thinking about. And there was also a housing commission. But I think the point is also that the Church of England can play a thought leadership role. And obviously what's been really fantastic is just how much both of the archbishops have come behind this issue. It's their number one sort of domestic policy issue that they're talking about when they have the opportunity, both privately and publicly, and they will continue to do that. So I think them asking to do the commission, but the sort of has further fueled their own desire to show leadership. We had a great interfaith dialogue, and it's very shared with other faith leaders who also would like their communities to be seeing this as a priority locally, and we are looking at how we can develop resources and toolkits for local churches and faith communities who want to do things in this area, so they're not reinventing the wheel, and that they also do it in a co-produced and asset-based way, rather than the sort of somebody has a good idea and doing to others. So we are looking at ways that can be taken forward and implemented. So hopefully that gives a sense of the role that the church hopefully will play in this.
Yeah, thanks ever so also, Anna, for reminding us of the housing commission that took place in the last 18 months, 2 years as well. And that had some really important findings about understanding the church's assets and the community's assets. And we've seen some really good examples of almshouses. I was intrigued when Boris was talking about St Oswald's, that presumably had some element as well of church land as well on that Gloucestershire site.
I was going to say, I don't think what we're going to see is new care providers, partly because of, like Boris's, the challenges of coming into that market. But obviously there are some big faith-based providers like Jewish
Absolutely.
Care, MHA, Abbeyfield, you know, where the values and principles sort of are very aligned to, you know, what the Commission is talking about. But I'd be interested, yeah, I mean, Boris may have views on sort of what role he thinks churches and faith communities could play working alongside with the existing sector.
Yeah, any thoughts on that, Boris?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think so. The church has got land, and some areas have been good at using that land to deliver affordable housing or supported housing. Yet again, Gloucestershire, as it happens, is particularly good at that, and we've developed a number of sites with the diocese. So I think there is a kind of a delivery piece for the church, which is around utilisation of land and whether the church, you know, leases the land up and keeps it as a kind of an asset and whatever. There's various ways you can do that. I think Anna's right. The church role here is probably in the leadership space, thought leadership space around values, ethos, ethics, and political pressure to make different things happen. Because fundamentally, this is a problem of the allocation of scarce resources, whether that's, you know, buildings or care. And that means it's fundamentally a political decision about how you tax or how much you tax and how and where you spend. And that actually is the biggest, I think. I know that sounds like kind of callous and brutal and simplistic, but fundamentally, this is a solution that requires a higher priority around where government puts the money it raises from taxes. And unless you do that, anything else is kind of marginal gains. So I think the role of the church here is to create. I think someone in the chat was talking about, you know, we need to be making more noise about how unacceptable all of this is. So I think that the role is for the church. You know, I really like the stuff on ethics and values and reimagining, but actually it's to get the politicians to tax and spend in the correct way to fix this like fundamental money problem. There are loads of other problems with it, but unless you fix the money problem, you can't fix really the whole system.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm conscious that Baroness Andrews had to go and vote. She's a working live peer, so and the House is back in voting, so she may join us. And I was going to pick up on a really important question that the Guy had raised around part M42, M43. She's in part answered that in the answer box if you wish to have a look at that. I know that there was also other questions around housing associations, around the viability and issues that raised in the questions as well. So Vicky Allen talks about, I'll be interested to know if you think it's assumed additional cost or housing association not thinking about the longer term benefits. And I suppose I'm thinking about the types of dividends of those investments, Boris, in those communities. And also, you know, some of the challenges that Rich highlighted in terms of identifying appropriate accommodation to move to where he could, where you're going to be moving to. I'm delighted to hear in the next month or so. So, any other sort of points on that viability point, Boris?
Yeah, I'll cover it really quickly because I think it's important that you know, we hear from Rich. So basically, there's no problem with the viability of delivering supported housing. Okay, no fundamental problem with it, as long as there is enough kind of revenue support and or the kind of overall costs of that don't make kind of service charges unaffordable. The only way, so housing associations can take a hit, you know, we're not for profit, but if we spend money on stuff to make it work financially, then that means we don't spend money on repairs over here or money advice over here. So we have, you know, there's this much money, how we chop and spend that, you know, is a kind of social purpose business model discussion. What I'm saying is, we're running out of road on this. The costs of subsidy now, the management costs of managing complex schemes combined with the costs of provision of care and service charges, this starts to become a kind of too difficult to do problem. And as soon as you're in the, this is a bit complicated and it loses money and you're into inevitably questions, as you said at the start, Jeremy, about the board saying, well, you know, we've got to be more efficient. We've got some choices. It starts to become a choice, not a, this is what we do. The choice then becomes, should we do this? And that's where I think you have a problem of sort of sector shrinkage.
Yeah, no, really important. And Rich, are those are sort of the difficulties that you've experienced on a day-to-day basis in terms of trying to identify the types of housing that you wanted to move to, or actually your choices were so restricted and you've had to wait as a result of that for much longer than you would have wanted to?
Yeah, I feel the whole process has been out of my control. I currently live in private rented accommodation, but over the last 16 months, I've sat at the top of the housing waiting list, and there's been nothing that's come up that's suitable. And it's taken a brand new development, which, yes, is brilliant for the local community because it's also going to house affordable housing options on the development, but it saves a lot of the current stock that we have in Shropshire. And if I'm one individual who's experiencing difficulties in finding alternative accommodation, what is the state of the rest of the country in?
Yeah, no, that's really important. And I was just looking at Kate's just posted something in the Q&A box which highlights some of the real system pressures about which actually drives more dependency into the system, and because actually we're creating more mini institutions, she's commented on. And some of the real challenges then about looking at alternative housing solutions and the rights to that as well, as you've just described. Look, I'm conscious of time. We've got a few questions. Kay, are there any final comments? I know that I was going to ask you about Guy's question. I know that you've answered that in part in the chat box. Are there any other things that you want to sort of come back to before we draw this to a close and I invite everybody else to have a final say?
I don't think so. Some very, very good questions. And I think my answers are pretty inadequate by and large, because I've been multitasking, listening and thinking about the questions as well. And I think this question, you know, we really, really do need to have more evidence, which is agreed on what the costs of adaptations are and how they add to the value of the property, so that we can close off the developer's argument that it's too expensive, or the housing association's argument that it's too much trouble, it goes too far. I really do think we need to get some stuff commissioned on these real costs, and I think that makes a difference. I think the last point about developing small institutions which are supposed to look like homes but don't feel like homes is a real problem. I think it's a terrible worry actually for parents whose children are growing older and do leave home, but then they don't really have a home in the sense, and so many of them don't go anywhere because they can't. They live with their parents, and there's a terrible worry as parents grow older, and that's something else that isn't factored into our, you know, into our appreciation of how we need to change. This are lifetime commitments. We need lifetime, resources and propositions for them.
No, thanks for that. That's very useful. Right, I'm going to go around my screen, and Rich, I'm going to start with you. Are there any final comments that you'd like to make or observations from this session that you'd like to refer to?
No, I just think in what the title of today's webinar is, I'm really pleased that we've had time to discuss a little bit more in depth the report and the offshoots of what that means for people, local citizens, leaders, and communities.
Boris, any final comments?
No, I think I'm just grateful to the Church Commission for reminding me about the importance of the values, ethos, and ethics, so I don't get kind of lost in viability and building and regulation. So thank you for that.
Anna, I'm going to leave the final word to you before I conclude. So,
well, I'd just like to thank everyone else on the panel. It's been fantastic to sort of get the feedback, really, because you do this work, and one of the hopes is that, you know, you do bring, you know, some different sort of ideas and values to the debate, and we were really keen not to retread the ground of a lot of technical reports that have gone before us, or lots of arguments about funding, and to really get to the heart of what it is to live and love and be in relationship. And, you know, hearing sort of Rich talk about that, you know, mutuality and so on has been fantastic. That, you know, providers like, you know, like Boris is, you know, being sort of reminded about why you do what you do, and obviously the fantastic work that Kay's doing in the House, in Parliament, showing leadership, to really make sure that this is an issue that all parties going into the next election, you know, they feel the heat, that they know this is visible, valuable, vital, that, you know, we do something about care and support in a way that we haven't done over the last 20 years. And, you know, housing is a critical part of that. It's fantastic that that link between housing and care, and indeed health, is really so deeply embedded now. But at the moment, I think we're hearing, you know, it doesn't work. We're not providing the housing choices for people, and those that do want to and are in the market are even thinking about leaving it. So that's really like bad news, isn't it? So whilst we take hope that we have a shared vision, that we're all pushing for things that are going to improve, we've got to fix some of these issues that are actually stopping and not allowing people like Rich to live the life that he wants, that don't allow Boris as a provider to actually do more of the good stuff. So we do need to fix it, and we'll continue to work very closely with Baroness Andrews to implement recommendations from both of our reports. And so thank you, Jeremy, for inviting us and giving us this opportunity.
It's been a great privilege, and thank you for your time this afternoon. Well, thank you all of you for making this such a rich debate, and for your contributions. I was just struck by the conversation we've had, and apologies that we haven't been able to answer all the questions, but if there are points that you've raised or want to share with us, I know, Amanda, you talked about Kingdom Housing, do send us information or a blog. Justin, you talked about intergenerational home share, very interested in that too, so please do share some thought leadership for us. We're a learning network, we want to learn from each other. But if you're really interested in the supported housing field specifically, and the benefits that are really tangible, particularly for the NHS, please do join us at next week's Happy Hour, where we'll be joined by Look Ahead Housing Association in London, and some of their work they're doing in East London with some of the mental health acute trusts to prevent people who are homeless, but also to support easier transfer of care back home. And we're also joined by NHS England, who are going to be talking about their work around community response services and providing more tailored support and timely intervention. So again, and showing the benefit of those as well. So again, I think that will follow on very neatly from this session. But all it leaves me to say is thank you all for making great contributions. Can I thank everybody who participated in some really rich questions? I'm sorry we couldn't get back around to all of those. Can I thank the team behind the scenes, Sally and co, for joining us. I'm really sorry that we couldn't show Jenny's video, but we will have that on screen. And please do join us again for a future Happy Hour, if not next week at another time of your convenience. So thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye.